The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Atlanta as Dr. Marcus Thompson hurried through the bustling streets toward the Centers for Disease Control headquarters. Coffee shops were already filled with the usual crowd of commuters, their conversations mixing with the sound of traffic and construction work from a nearby building site. Marcus clutched his briefcase tighter, reviewing in his mind the strange reports that had been flooding in overnight from hospitals across the southeastern United States. Patients arriving with fever, aggression, and bizarre behavioral changes that didn't match any known pathogen in the medical literature. Detective Riley Foster was 3 blocks away, responding to her 4th domestic disturbance call of the morning. Each incident had been stranger than the last, families reporting that their loved ones had suddenly become violent, exhibiting superhuman strength and an apparent inability to feel pain. As she pulled up to the latest address, a modest 2-story home in a quiet residential neighborhood, Riley noticed the unusual silence. No sirens, no shouting, just an eerie calm that made her instinctively rest her hand on her service weapon. The front door stood ajar, revealing darkness beyond, and she could hear what sounded like wet, tearing noises coming from inside. Meanwhile, across town at Fort McPherson, Sergeant Jake Rodriguez was suiting up for what his commanding officer had described as an urban pacification mission. The details were classified, but Jake had served 3 tours overseas and recognized the tension in his superior's voice. Something big was happening, something that required the National Guard to mobilize with live ammunition for domestic operations. As he checked his equipment one final time, Jake noticed other units receiving similar orders, their faces reflecting the same mixture of confusion and professional readiness that he felt. The first sign that this wasn't an ordinary Tuesday came at exactly 9:47 a.m. when Marcus heard screaming from the CDC lobby below his office. He rushed to the window and witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A security guard attacking a visitor with his bare hands, biting and clawing with animalistic fury. The visitor's screams were cut short as more people in the lobby began exhibiting the same violent behavior, turning on anyone within reach. Marcus grabbed his emergency phone and called the building's security chief, but the line went dead after 3 rings. Riley had just stepped through the damaged front door when she heard the call come through her radio, multiple 10 to 54 reports flooding in from across the city. Possible mental health emergencies were being reported at an unprecedented rate, with officers requesting immediate backup at dozens of locations simultaneously. The wet sounds from upstairs had stopped, replaced by an ominous shuffling noise. As she climbed the creaking stairs, weapon drawn, Riley tried to make sense of the blood trail leading from the living room toward the bedrooms. Nothing in her 15 years of police work had prepared her for what she found at the top of the landing, a scene that defied rational explanation and would force her to question everything she thought she knew about human nature. Jake's unit received their deployment orders while still in the armory. Reports were coming in of widespread civil unrest, with emergency services overwhelmed by the sheer volume of violent incidents. The sergeant major's briefing was unusually tense, mentioning something about a potential biological agent and the need to maintain strict quarantine protocols. As they loaded into armored vehicles, Jake noticed that medical personnel were being issued hazmat equipment alongside their standard gear. The convoy moved through increasingly chaotic streets where abandoned cars and broken storefronts suggested that whatever was happening had spread beyond isolated incidents. By noon, the 3 strangers who would later become unlikely allies were each fighting for survival in their own desperate situations. Marcus found himself barricaded in his laboratory with 2 colleagues, watching through reinforced windows as his infected co-workers roamed the hallways with vacant eyes and blood-stained clothing. Riley was trapped in her patrol car, surrounded by people who no longer seemed entirely human, their faces twisted with an insatiable hunger that bullets seemed unable to fully stop. Jake's unit had been scattered during their first encounter with the infected, leaving him separated from his team in an urban landscape that resembled a war zone more than an American city. As emergency broadcasts filled the airwaves with contradictory information and the government struggled to maintain control of the narrative, one thing became terrifyingly clear: this wasn't just another crisis that could be managed through conventional means. The infected weren't responding to negotiation, medical treatment, or standard law enforcement techniques. They moved with singular purpose, showing no recognition of their former relationships or regard for their own safety. The outbreak was spreading faster than authorities could contain it, and traditional emergency response protocols were proving inadequate against an enemy that had once been neighbors, friends, and family members. The battle for humanity's future had begun, though few realized it yet. 3 days had passed since the world changed forever, and the North Point shopping mall had become an unlikely fortress for 47 survivors who had managed to escape the chaos-consuming Atlanta. Emma Williams, a high school biology teacher, stood watch at the main entrance barricade, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Behind her, she could hear the quiet conversations of her students, teenagers who had aged years in just 72 hours, their youthful optimism replaced by a grim determination to survive. Tommy Martinez, her star pupil, was helping reinforce windows with shopping cart barriers while Jessica Brown and Kevin O'Malley worked together to inventory their dwindling medical supplies. The mall's former Radio Shack had been converted into a communication center where Tony Russo, a burly mechanic with grease-stained hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of electronics, worked frantically to restore contact with the outside world. His modified CB radio crackled with static and occasional fragments of desperate voices from other survivor groups scattered across the region. Patricia Davis, an emergency room nurse who had witnessed the outbreak's first victims, moved efficiently between the makeshift medical station in the old Barnes & Noble and the food court where families huddled around battery-powered radios, hoping for news that rescue was coming. The infected had found them on the second day. What started as isolated encounters with single zombies had escalated into increasingly large groups that seemed drawn by noise and movement. Tony had quickly learned to muffle the generator that powered their essential equipment, while Emma organized her students into quiet patrol teams that could spot approaching threats without drawing attention. The mall's multiple entrances had initially seemed like an advantage, providing escape routes and ventilation, but now they represented vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance. Commander Blake Harrison arrived at dawn on the third day with 12 survivors from a failed military checkpoint, his tactical vest torn and his usually precise bearing showing signs of strain. The former Navy SEAL brought valuable combat experience and confirmed what many had feared: the government's initial response had been catastrophically inadequate. Safe zones were falling across the southeastern states, and military units were either overwhelmed or had gone dark entirely. Blake's group included Maria Santos, a paramedic whose quick thinking had saved 3 children during the evacuation of Children's Healthcare, and David Kim, an engineering student whose improvised explosive devices had helped them break through zombie cordons. The first major test came at midday when a horde of over 200 infected surrounded the mall, drawn by the sound of Tony's generator and the scent of living humans. Emma watched through binoculars as the mass of former people pressed against the reinforced doors, their moans creating a sound like wind through a cemetery. Some still wore the clothes they had dyed in: business suits, hospital scrubs, even a few police uniforms that made her stomach turn. Blake immediately took charge of the defensive preparations, positioning his experienced fighters at key choke points while Emma's students took elevated positions with improvised weapons and Molotov cocktails that Tony had taught them to make from cleaning supplies. Patricia worked to calm the younger children while secretly checking their ammunition count, knowing that their supply of bullets wouldn't last long against such numbers. The nurse had seen what happened when the infected got close enough to bite. The fever that followed was swift and invariably fatal, followed by reanimation within hours. She had been forced to make impossible decisions in those early days, and the weight of those choices showed in the lines around her eyes. The battle began when the western entrance barriers finally gave way under the pressure of countless hands and bodies. Blake's team formed a defensive line using overturned tables and shopping carts, their military training evident in their coordinated movements and disciplined fire. Emma's students supported them with thrown weapons and diversionary tactics, while Tony used his engineering skills to create electrical barriers that could stun approaching zombies long enough for the fighters to finish them off. For 6 hours, the mall echoed with gunfire, breaking glass, and the otherworldly sounds of the infected. Maria Santos worked tirelessly to treat bite wounds and injuries, knowing that any broken skin could mean death. David Kim's homemade explosives proved crucial in collapsing sections of the mall's upper level, creating barriers that funneled the infected into kill zones where Blake's people could eliminate them more efficiently. As evening approached, the tide began to turn. The survivors had learned to work as a team, combining their different skills and knowledge to create defensive strategies that none could have managed alone. Emma's teaching experience helped her coordinate the younger survivors, while Tony's mechanical expertise kept their equipment functioning under extreme conditions. Patricia's medical knowledge saved lives that might otherwise have been lost to infection or blood loss. When the last zombie fell, the mall was damaged but secure. The survivors had lost 3 people, but they had proved something important to themselves: ordinary people could fight back against this nightmare and win. As they tended their wounds and reinforced their defenses, they began to understand that survival wouldn't just depend on weapons and walls, but on their ability to maintain their humanity while facing an inhuman enemy. The first stand was over, but the real war was just beginning. Dr. Marcus Thompson finally reached the survivor camp at North Point Mall on the fourth day, his CDC credentials and crucial information earning him immediate access to Commander Blake Harrison's leadership council. His arrival brought both hope and terrifying revelations that would change everything the survivors thought they knew about their situation. Marcus carried with him a waterproof case containing research files from his Atlanta laboratory, documents that revealed the outbreak's true origins and suggested that their fight was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The makeshift conference room in the former GameStop buzzed with tension as Marcus spread classified documents across a folding table. Emma Williams leaned forward, her teacher's instincts recognizing the importance of what they were about to learn, while Tony Russo adjusted his jury-rigged lighting system to illuminate the papers more clearly. Patricia Davis stood nearby, her medical training helping her interpret the biological data that Marcus began to explain in careful, measured tones that couldn't quite hide his own fear and guilt. The outbreak hadn't been natural or accidental. Marcus revealed that 3 weeks before the first reported cases, a breach had occurred at a classified government research facility known only as Blackwater Labs, located 30 miles northeast of Atlanta. The facility had been conducting experiments on a modified strain of rabies virus, attempting to create biological weapons that could incapacitate enemy forces without permanent harm. The project, codenamed Lazarus Protocol, had been designed to create temporary aggression and disorientation, but something had gone catastrophically wrong during the final testing phase. Blake Harrison's military experience allowed him to fill in the gaps that Marcus's scientific perspective had missed. The commander explained that Blackwater Labs was part of a network of research facilities developing next-generation biological weapons, funded through black-budget programs that operated without congressional oversight. When the breach occurred, the initial response had been containment rather than cure, with government officials more concerned about covering up the illegal research than protecting civilian populations. The revelation sent shockwaves through the survivor community. Maria Santos, the paramedic who had seen the outbreak's early victims, realized that the government had known exactly what they were dealing with while hospitals and first responders remained completely unprepared. David Kim, the engineering student, began connecting dots between the coordinated military withdrawals and the suspicious gaps in emergency broadcasts that had left civilians confused and vulnerable during the crucial first hours. Marcus continued his briefing with even more disturbing information. The virus was continuing to mutate in ways that the original researchers had never anticipated. Early infected individuals were showing signs of increased coordination and problem-solving abilities, suggesting that the pathogen was evolving rapidly in response to environmental pressures. Worse, preliminary data indicated that the zombies were developing resistance to conventional weapons, their nervous systems adapting to trauma in ways that made them increasingly difficult to stop permanently. The group's youngest members, Emma students, listened with growing alarm as Marcus described encounters with infected individuals who had retained fragments of their former memories and skills. Tommy Martinez asked the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. If the zombies were getting smarter and stronger, how long could any human settlement hope to survive? Jessica Brown, who had lost her parents in the initial outbreak, wondered aloud whether the government had any plans to help survivors or if they were truly on their own. Tony Russo's technical expertise became crucial as Marcus explained that Blackwater Labs had been working on potential countermeasures before the facility was evacuated. The research included experimental treatments that might slow the infection's progress and prototype devices designed to disrupt the zombie nervous system. However, accessing this information would require reaching the abandoned laboratory, a journey that would take them through some of the most heavily infected areas in the region. Patricia Davis raised the medical implications of Marcus's revelations, pointing out that their current treatment protocols were completely inadequate if the virus was continuing to evolve. The bite wounds they had been treating with basic antibiotics and wound care might require entirely different approaches if the pathogen was adapting to human immune responses. She suggested that reaching the laboratory wasn't just about finding weapons or answers. It might be their only hope of developing effective medical countermeasures. As the briefing concluded, Blake Harrison began formulating plans for a reconnaissance mission to Blackwater Labs. The facility's location made it extremely dangerous to reach, but the potential benefits outweighed the risks. The commander emphasized that this wouldn't be a suicide mission but a carefully planned operation using their best people and equipment. Emma volunteered immediately, her knowledge of biology making her valuable for interpreting research data, while Tony offered his technical skills for accessing laboratory computers and equipment. The search for answers had begun, but Marcus's revelations made one thing clear: they weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. If the zombies continued evolving and spreading, the fate of human civilization itself hung in the balance. The survivors at North Point Mall were no longer just refugees from a local disaster. They had become humanity's last hope for understanding and potentially stopping a threat that could end their species forever. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The attack came at dawn on the 7th day, when the survivors least expected it. Emma Williams was conducting her morning perimeter check when she spotted the massive horde approaching from the east, easily 3 times larger than any group they had faced before. These weren't the shambling, disorganized masses of the early days. They moved with disturbing coordination, spreading out to surround the mall in a tactical formation that suggested intelligence behind their assault. Through her binoculars, Emma could see that many of the infected were wearing military fatigues, their deteriorated faces still bearing the discipline of their former training. Commander Blake Harrison immediately activated the emergency protocols they had developed, but even his military experience couldn't hide the grim reality: they were vastly outnumbered and running critically low on ammunition. Tony Russo worked frantically to implement their escape plan, using his mechanical expertise to prepare the vehicles they had been secretly modifying in the mall's service areas. Patricia Davis began organizing the medical supplies and ensuring that the wounded could be transported, while Marcus Thompson secured his research materials and the precious data they had recovered about the Blackwater Labs facility. The zombies struck the western barriers first, their assault coordinated in waves that seemed designed to overwhelm specific defensive positions. Maria Santos found herself leading a group of teenagers in defending the food court entrance, her paramedic training helping her stay calm under pressure while directing their limited firepower where it would be most effective. David Kim's improvised explosives bought them precious time, collapsing sections of the mall structure to create choke points that slowed the infected advance. As the battle intensified, it became clear that this wasn't just another random attack. The infected seemed to know exactly where the survivors' weak points were located, and their assault focused on cutting off escape routes rather than simply overwhelming the defenders. Emma realized with growing horror that they were being hunted by an enemy that had learned from previous encounters, an enemy that was adapting its tactics based on hard-won experience. The breakthrough came at the north entrance, where a group of infected had somehow bypassed their early warning systems and breached the inner barriers. Tommy Martinez and Jessica Brown found themselves cut off from the main group, fighting desperately to reach the rally point where Blake was coordinating the evacuation. Kevin O'Malley, who had shown remarkable courage throughout their ordeal, made the difficult decision to stay behind and hold a critical corridor, buying time for the others to escape while sacrificing his own chance at survival. Tony's modified vehicles roared to life in the loading dock area, their reinforced frames and improvised armor representing weeks of careful preparation for this moment. The mechanic had converted delivery trucks into mobile fortresses, complete with gun ports and emergency medical stations that Patricia had helped design. As survivors piled into the vehicles, the sound of breaking glass and inhuman moans echoed through the mall's corridors, marking the final collapse of their sanctuary. The convoy's escape through the infected-filled parking lot became a nightmare of twisted metal and desperate courage. Blake's military training proved invaluable as he directed their movement through gaps in the zombie masses, while Emma used her knowledge of local geography to guide them toward their predetermined destination. Marcus clutched his research materials and wondered if the information they carried would be enough to justify the lives they were losing. During the chaotic evacuation, they lost 7 people, including several of Emma's students who had become like family over their week together. The grief was overwhelming, but there was no time to mourn as infected continued pursuing their vehicles along the abandoned highways. Patricia worked to treat injuries in the back of a speeding truck while Tony pushed their makeshift convoy to its mechanical limits, knowing that stopping meant death for everyone. Their destination was Fort Daniels, an abandoned military base that Blake had identified as their best hope for establishing a more secure stronghold. The facility had been evacuated during the early days of the outbreak, but its concrete barriers and underground facilities offered better protection than any civilian structure they could find. More importantly, Marcus believed that the base's communication equipment might help them contact other survivor groups and coordinate a larger resistance effort. The arrival at Fort Daniels brought both relief and new challenges. The base was indeed abandoned, but it showed signs of a hasty evacuation that suggested the military personnel had left in desperate circumstances. Equipment lay scattered in the command center, and there were clear signs of defensive battles that had taken place during the final hours before withdrawal. Most disturbing were the bloodstains and claw marks that indicated not all of the base personnel had escaped their fate. As the survivors worked to secure the facility and tend their wounds, they discovered they weren't alone. Dr. Victoria Lane emerged from the base's underground laboratory complex, a brilliant virologist who had been conducting research on potential treatments when the facility was abandoned. Her presence offered new hope, but her haggard appearance and the haunted look in her eyes suggested that she carried knowledge that might be as terrifying as it was valuable. The Great Escape was over, but their real work was just beginning. Chat Controls Sonnet 4. 2 weeks after their arrival at Fort Daniels, the abandoned military base had been transformed into humanity's most organized stronghold against the zombie apocalypse. Commander Blake Harrison had implemented a strict but fair system of governance that utilized everyone's skills while maintaining the discipline necessary for survival. The base's concrete walls and underground facilities provided security that allowed the survivors to focus on long-term planning rather than mere day-to-day survival, and for the first time since the outbreak began, people dared to hope for something beyond simple endurance. Dr. Victoria Lane's laboratory had become the heart of their resistance efforts, where she worked alongside Dr. Marcus Thompson to develop practical countermeasures against the evolving zombie threat. Victoria's research revealed disturbing patterns in the infection's progression. The virus was not only mutating rapidly but seemed to be developing distinct variants with different capabilities. Some infected retained more of their human intelligence, while others had enhanced physical strength or improved sensory abilities. Most troubling were reports of infected individuals who appeared to be communicating with each other through primitive vocalizations and coordinated movements. Emma Williams had established a comprehensive training program that turned ordinary civilians into competent fighters and strategists. Her teaching background proved invaluable in helping people learn quickly under pressure, and she had developed educational materials that covered everything from weapon maintenance to zombie behavior patterns. Tommy Martinez and Jessica Brown had become her assistant instructors, their youth and enthusiasm helping to maintain morale while they taught younger survivors the skills they would need to defend themselves and others. Tony Russo's mechanical genius had created a workshop that produced ingenious weapons and defensive systems from salvaged materials. His latest innovations included silent crossbows with retrievable bolts, portable barriers that could be quickly deployed to create defensive positions, and communication devices that allowed teams to coordinate without alerting nearby infected. The mechanic had also been working with David Kim to develop more sophisticated traps and early warning systems that could give them advance notice of approaching zombie hordes. The base's medical facilities, under Patricia Davis's supervision, had evolved into a research center where they studied captured infected specimens to understand the virus's weaknesses. Patricia's emergency room experience proved crucial in developing surgical techniques for treating severe bite wounds, while her collaboration with Victoria and Marcus led to protocols for identifying early infection symptoms and potential treatment approaches. Maria Santos had become her deputy, using her paramedic training to establish mobile medical units that could support field operations. Blake's military expertise had created specialized teams within their community, each focused on different aspects of their survival and resistance efforts. The reconnaissance team, led by experienced survivors like Jake Rodriguez who had finally reached the base with intelligence about other survivor colonies, gathered information about zombie movements and searched for other human settlements. The defense team maintained the base's security and trained civilians in combat techniques, while the research team focused on understanding their enemy and developing countermeasures. The most significant development came when Victoria made a breakthrough in understanding the virus's communication mechanisms. Her research revealed that infected individuals were sharing information through chemical signals similar to those used by insects, creating a primitive but effective network that allowed them to coordinate attacks and share knowledge about human defensive strategies. This discovery explained why zombie tactics had been improving over time and suggested that their enemy was essentially a single, learning organism rather than individual monsters. The implications were staggering. If the infected could share experiences and adapt their behavior collectively, then every encounter with human survivors was making the entire zombie population smarter and more dangerous. Blake immediately implemented new protocols that emphasized stealth and misdirection over direct confrontation, while Emma began teaching guerrilla warfare tactics that could help smaller groups avoid detection while accomplishing their objectives. Training exercises became more sophisticated as the survivors learned to work together as a unified fighting force. Jake Rodriguez brought military discipline to civilian volunteers, teaching them movement techniques and communication protocols that could mean the difference between success and disaster during field operations. The teenagers who had survived the mall siege became some of the most effective scouts, their youth and adaptability allowing them to move through infected territory with remarkable skill. The base also became a beacon for other survivors, as Tony's improved radio equipment allowed them to establish contact with scattered groups across the southeastern United States. They learned that several other military installations had been abandoned but might contain valuable resources or research materials. More importantly, they discovered that their efforts to understand and fight the infection were part of a larger network of resistance movements that were slowly emerging across the country. As their first month at Fort Daniels concluded, the survivors had evolved from desperate refugees into a disciplined resistance organization with clear goals and the resources to achieve them. They had learned that survival wasn't enough. They needed to actively fight back against an enemy that was constantly growing stronger and smarter. The building phase was complete, and they were ready to take the fight to the infected on their own terms. Chat Controls Sonnet 4. The first sign that something fundamental had changed came during what should have been a routine supply run to a nearby abandoned pharmacy. Jake Rodriguez led a small reconnaissance team including Tommy Martinez and 2 other experienced scouts, following protocols that had kept them safe for weeks. They moved silently through the deserted streets, using hand signals and predetermined routes that avoided known infected gathering areas. But when they reached the pharmacy, they found something that defied everything they thought they understood about zombie behavior. The infected were waiting for them in a carefully planned ambush. The attack wasn't the mindless rush they had come to expect. Instead, infected individuals had positioned themselves at strategic locations around the building, remaining motionless and silent until Jake's team was completely surrounded. When the assault began, it demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that sent chills through every survivor who heard the radio reports. The zombies used coordinated pincer movements, blocked escape routes, and even employed what appeared to be diversionary tactics to confuse their human prey. Jake's team barely escaped, but their debriefing at Fort Daniels revealed disturbing details that forced Dr. Victoria Lane and Dr. Marcus Thompson to reconsider their understanding of the virus's progression. The infected had shown patience, waiting for hours in uncomfortable positions without moving or making sound. They had demonstrated forward planning by positioning themselves before the humans arrived, suggesting they could anticipate human behavior patterns and prepare accordingly. Most terrifying of all, some of the infected had used primitive tools, picking up rocks and broken glass to use as weapons. Emma Williams immediately called for enhanced security measures while Blake Harrison began revising their operational procedures. The comfortable routines they had developed were no longer adequate against an enemy that could learn from their patterns and adapt countermeasures. Patricia Davis reported similar changes in the infected specimens they had captured for research. The creatures were showing increased problem-solving abilities and seemed to be studying their captors as much as being studied. The situation deteriorated rapidly when David Kim discovered evidence of a traitor within their ranks. Security cameras in the laboratory showed someone accessing restricted research files and communication equipment during night shifts when most of the base was asleep. The betrayal sent shockwaves through their tight-knit community, raising questions about trust and loyalty that threatened to tear apart the unity they had worked so hard to build. Blake implemented immediate security protocols, but the damage to morale was significant. The traitor was revealed to be Dr. Richard Hayes, a researcher who had joined their group only 2 weeks earlier after claiming to escape from a fallen survivor colony in South Carolina. Under interrogation, Hayes revealed that he had been in contact with a faction of military officials who believed the zombie outbreak could be controlled and used as a biological weapon against enemy nations. This shadow government group was systematically undermining survivor colonies that showed too much independence or scientific progress, viewing them as threats to their plans for maintaining power in the post-apocalyptic world. Hayes's betrayal had provided the infected with detailed information about Fort Daniels' defenses, patrol schedules, and research progress. Worse, his communications had revealed the location of other survivor settlements that were now at risk of coordinated attacks. The revelation that some humans were actively working against other survivors added a new dimension of horror to their already desperate situation, forcing them to consider that their own species might be as dangerous as the infected. Victoria's latest research provided the scientific explanation for the zombies' rapid evolution. The virus was incorporating genetic material from its hosts at an accelerated rate, essentially allowing the infected population to develop new capabilities within weeks rather than the generations typically required for evolutionary change. Each human victim contributed their knowledge and skills to the collective zombie intelligence, creating a feedback loop that made the infected progressively more dangerous with every person they consumed. The base's early warning systems detected the approaching megahorde 3 days before it arrived, a massive concentration of infected numbering in the thousands, moving with unprecedented coordination toward Fort Daniels. Reconnaissance reports described a terrifying sight. Zombies marching in formation with what appeared to be command structures and specialized roles within their ranks. Some infected carried crude weapons, while others seemed to serve as scouts or communication relays for the larger force. Most disturbing of all was the presence of what survivors began calling alpha zombies, infected individuals who retained significant portions of their human intelligence while gaining the virus's enhanced physical capabilities. These creatures appeared to be directing the Horde's movements, using tactical knowledge that suggested they had once been military personnel or law enforcement officers. The approaching army represented not just a threat to Fort Daniels, but potentially the end of organized human resistance in the entire region. As the survivors prepared for what might be their final battle, they realized that the enemy they faced had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. The zombies were no longer mindless monsters but a coordinated military force with strategic intelligence and overwhelming numbers. The evolution was complete and humanity's time was running out. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The messenger arrived at dawn on a stolen motorcycle, bleeding from multiple wounds and barely conscious from exhaustion. Captain Sarah Mitchell of the 82nd Airborne brought news that changed everything the Fort Daniels survivors thought they knew about their situation. Government forces were still operational, coordinating from hardened bunkers in the Rocky Mountains, and they had been monitoring survivor colonies across the country through satellite surveillance. More importantly, they had developed a plan to establish permanent safe zones, but it required the cooperation of groups like theirs who had proven they could fight effectively against the evolved infected. Commander Blake Harrison immediately convened an emergency leadership meeting as Captain Mitchell recovered in Patricia Davis's medical bay. The news was both encouraging and terrifying. They weren't alone in their fight, but the government's plan required them to abandon Fort Daniels and travel over 300 miles to reach the nearest designated rally point. The journey would take them through some of the most heavily infected territory in the southeastern United States, and there was no guarantee that the promised safe zone would actually exist when they arrived. Dr. Victoria Lane's breakthrough came at the worst possible time. Working frantically in her laboratory as the zombie megahorde approached, she had finally developed a weaponized version of her experimental cure, an aerosol compound that could disrupt the virus's communication networks and potentially reverse the infection process in recently turned individuals. The treatment worked by blocking the chemical signals that allowed infected individuals to coordinate their actions, essentially breaking the collective intelligence that made them so dangerous. Emma Williams faced an impossible choice as she looked at her remaining students, young people who had already survived more horror than most adults could imagine. The government's evacuation plan could save their lives, but it meant abandoning the research that might save humanity. Tommy Martinez and Jessica Brown had both volunteered to stay and fight, their courage inspiring but heartbreaking to someone who had watched too many of her students die already. The decision would define not just their immediate survival but the future of human civilization. Tony Russo presented the technical reality with his usual blunt honesty. They had enough vehicles and fuel to evacuate most of their people, but not enough to transport Victoria's laboratory equipment and research materials. The choice was stark: save the people or save the science that might eventually save everyone. His mechanical expertise had given them mobility and defensive capabilities, but it couldn't solve the fundamental problem of having too much to lose and too little time to save it all. The approaching horde had grown larger than their worst estimates, with reconnaissance reports indicating over 5,000 infected moving in coordinated formations toward their position. Jake Rodriguez's scouting teams identified multiple alpha zombies directing the assault, creatures whose retained intelligence made them terrifyingly effective commanders. The infected had learned from previous human tactics and were approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, making escape routes increasingly limited with each passing hour. Dr. Marcus Thompson made the proposal that would define their legacy. A small team would remain behind to implement Victoria's cure as a weapon against the megahorde while the majority of survivors evacuated toward the government rally point. The volunteers would use the base's remaining defenses to buy time for the evacuation while deploying the aerosol cure in a way that might disrupt the infected army's coordination. It was essentially a suicide mission disguised as a tactical operation. Blake Harrison, Emma Williams, Tony Russo, and Victoria Lane volunteered immediately, joined by several others who understood that someone had to make the sacrifice. Patricia Davis and Maria Santos would lead the evacuation convoy, ensuring that the younger survivors and essential personnel reached safety. The decision was made democratically, but the weight of it crushed everyone who participated in the vote. The final preparations took on a surreal quality as people said goodbye to friends they might never see again. David Kim rigged the base's remaining explosives to create diversions that might help the evacuation convoy escape undetected. Tommy and Jessica tearfully accepted their assignment to help protect the younger children during the journey, understanding that their teachers were asking them to grow up completely and immediately. Captain Mitchell's radio equipment allowed them to coordinate with the government forces for the first time since the outbreak began. The confirmation that other survivor colonies had successfully reached safe zones provided hope, but also revealed the magnitude of their sacrifice. They were giving up certain rescue for an uncertain chance to strike a meaningful blow against the infected hordes that threatened all remaining human settlements. As the zombie army crested the hills surrounding Fort Daniels, the defenders could see the true scope of the evolved threat they faced. Thousands of infected moved with military precision, their coordination visible even from a distance. Alpha zombies could be identified by their purposeful movements and the way other infected responded to their directions. The final assault wasn't just a battle for Fort Daniels, it was humanity's last chance to prove that intelligence and courage could triumph over raw evolutionary adaptation. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The battle for Fort Daniels began at sunset with an artillery barrage of improvised explosives that David Kim had rigged throughout the surrounding hills. The coordinated detonations disrupted the zombie army's formation and bought precious time for the evacuation convoy to reach the first checkpoint on their journey to safety. Commander Blake Harrison watched through binoculars as Patricia Davis led their people away from the base, her medical training and steady leadership ensuring that even the youngest survivors maintained discipline during their desperate escape through infected territory. Emma Williams positioned herself in the communications center where she could coordinate the defense while simultaneously directing Victoria Lane's aerosol deployment strategy. Her teaching experience proved invaluable in managing the complex timing required to maximize the cure's effectiveness against the zombie horde. Tony Russo had rigged a series of fans and ventilation systems throughout the base that could disperse Victoria's weaponized treatment across the approaching infected masses, but the deployment would require perfect timing and enormous courage from everyone involved. The first wave of zombies reached the outer perimeter just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, their coordinated assault demonstrating the terrifying evolution of their tactical capabilities. Alpha zombies directed their forces with military precision, using flanking maneuvers and suppressing fire from improvised weapons to overwhelm defensive positions that had been designed to stop mindless hordes rather than intelligent armies. Jake Rodriguez and his remaining scout team fought desperately to hold key choke points while Marcus Thompson worked to calibrate the aerosol dispensers for maximum coverage. Victoria Lane's scientific breakthrough faced its ultimate test as the first clouds of weaponized cure began drifting across the battlefield. The effect was immediately visible. Infected individuals caught in the aerosol began stumbling and losing coordination as their collective intelligence network collapsed. Some zombies simply collapsed as the virus's hold on their nervous systems weakened, while others showed signs of returning human consciousness as the treatment temporarily reversed the infection's psychological effects. The battle's turning point came when Tony Russo realized that the cure's effectiveness could be amplified by using the base's emergency broadcasting system to transmit specific radio frequencies that Victoria had discovered could disrupt the virus's communication signals. His mechanical genius combined with her biological research created a synergistic effect that turned their defensive position into a weapon capable of affecting zombies across a much wider area than they had originally hoped. Blake Harrison led a desperate charge against the alpha zombies commanding the assault, understanding that disrupting their leadership might cause the entire attack to collapse into chaos. The former Navy SEAL's combat experience proved crucial as he engaged creatures that retained human intelligence while possessing enhanced physical capabilities. Each alpha zombie he eliminated caused visible confusion among their subordinates, proving that the evolved infected were still vulnerable to decapitation strikes against their command structure. As the night progressed, the combination of Victoria's cure, Tony's technical innovations, and the defenders' tactical expertise began turning the tide of battle. Large sections of the zombie army were collapsing into disorganized masses as their coordination networks failed, while others were actually reverting to human consciousness as the aerosol treatment proved more effective than anyone had dared hope. The scene was both triumphant and heartbreaking as some infected individuals recovered enough awareness to realize what they had become. Emma's coordination proved essential during the battle's climactic moments when government helicopters arrived earlier than expected, drawn by the radio signals that Tony had been broadcasting. The aerial support provided the firepower needed to break the zombie army's final assault, while also confirming that the evacuation convoy had successfully reached the rally point. Captain Mitchell's communication with the government forces revealed that similar battles were being fought at survivor colonies across the country, all coordinated to maximize the impact of Victoria's cure. The dawn revealed a transformed battlefield where thousands of zombie corpses lay scattered among hundreds of infected individuals who were slowly regaining their humanity. Victoria's treatment had worked beyond their wildest expectations, not only disrupting the virus's communication networks but actually reversing the infection in many cases where the disease hadn't progressed too far. The scientific breakthrough represented hope for eventual recovery of civilization rather than mere survival in isolated enclaves. The establishment of the first officially zombie-free zone began immediately as government forces arrived in full strength, bringing medical personnel, scientists, and resources needed to expand the cure's production and distribution. Emma, Blake, Tony, and Victoria had survived their suicide mission, but more importantly, they had proven that human ingenuity and sacrifice could overcome even the most terrifying evolutionary threats. Their victory at Fort Daniels became the turning point in humanity's war against the infected, marking the beginning of a long journey toward reclaiming their world. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since the outbreak began, survivors everywhere could look toward tomorrow with genuine hope rather than mere determination to survive another day. The ultimate battle between zombies and humans had ended not with humanity's extinction, but with the dawn of a new chapter in human civilization built on the courage of ordinary people who refused to surrender their species' future. Chat controls Sonnet 4.